Building a planet from scratch represents a level of technological prowess which is pretty much beyond even most science fiction. And today we're going to talk about that. So we're looking at a paper called Some Speculations on the Construction of Artificial Planets. And this is by an aerospace engineer from the University of Bristol. Now this is written a few years ago, 2005, and I've been reading this paper for a few years myself. Obviously not continuously, but I keep on coming back to it because on the one hand, it's pretty funny. It has a lot of laugh out loud moments for me. But on the other hand, I think it's the type of thought experiment that we need to be doing more of. So the context of trying to build a planet from scratch needs to be understood first. Obviously, we all understand that this is pretty much beyond the scope of even most science fiction in terms of how difficult it would be to do. But it's still interesting to think about in terms of what it requires you to consider in terms of like what actually is a violation of fundamental law of physics and what is maybe more just a violation of practical limits. And by understanding the difference between those two things, we can start to understand what might someday be possible if we had a completely different set of assumptions. The key assumption that would be different in a scenario where we're really like realistically talking about building a new planet is the energy issue. And I really think that this kind of conversation makes sense only if you're talking about a Kardashev 1 or probably a Kardashev 2 civilization. So for those not familiar with the Kardashev scale, it's essentially a way to rank the technological advancement of certain hypothetical species. And it was proposed by a Russian astronomer named Kardashev. And basically he measures, or he would speculate that we would measure the prowess of different alien civilizations or maybe our own advancement as the human civilization based on how much energy we were able to harness and control. Some people disagree with this as a notion of technological prowess. Different futurists kind of have different visions for what the future looks like. For some futurists, the idea that in the future we would have more like control over energy efficiency is more what they're looking for. There's sort of a goal for having a more elegant kind of civilization, technologically speaking, that is able to do more with less. But for others, and especially I think earlier thinkers, and I have a lot of sympathy for this view myself, it's more about how much energy can you harness? Because there's just certain things you can't do unless you have massive amounts of energy. So for Kardashev, a type 1 civilization would be able to access all the energy available on its planet and store it for consumption. Hypothetically, they should also be able to control natural events such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, etc. So a type 1 civilization is already pretty, borderline godlike if they can control the weather. And then a type 2 civilization can directly consume a star's energy. And so when we're talking about building a planet from scratch, as we talk through the how of this, you're going to see that the level of energy required, even in this thought experiment, probably puts you somewhere between a type 1 and a type 2 civilization. But if you start with that assumption of virtually unlimited energy, then the conversation around making a planet from scratch starts to sound a little less ridiculous. So for the rest of this video, we're going to touch on the reasons why you might want to build a planet from scratch. We're going to spend the majority of our time talking about the construction method proposed by Dr. Hempsell. And then we're going to kind of wrap up and talk about what I think are the real practical takeaways from this concept. Because believe it or not, I actually think there are practical takeaways from even kind of like an outlandish thought experiment like this. So as the author observes, artificial planets would perform basically the same function as other extraterrestrial habitats. The key ones are terraformed worlds. So this is sort of what Elon Musk is shooting for, right? He wants us to terraform Mars and make it to be a plan B for civilization. And then the other one are O'Neill space colonies. And I think it's worthwhile just to briefly touch on what an O'Neill space colony is. So basically, this is like a giant space station which has a truly livable and independent habitat in it. And the idea is that the typical format that people show is like usually a large cylinder, which is rotating, and the centrifugal force actually creates a sense of gravity for the people in it. And I guess you could say the futurist O'Neill proposed that these things could take on an absolutely massive scale. And you could have, I did read most of his book, actually. It was written several decades ago. And the idea has taken a lot of popularity since then. But the idea is you could have maybe like a land mass or like a surface area of livable space, like the size of a small country. I think the example he brought up was he was shooting for like a land mass, like the size of Denmark. And you can see in this artist's depiction of it that now, I don't know why the walls are partially transparent. That's pretty wild. I guess maybe they wanted to have some stars in it. But the typical one that I've seen is basically just there's living habitat all on the inside of the cylinder. And this is pretty wild. This is pretty extreme because you can see that there's actually forests and cities and villages and things like that all on the inside of this space cylinder. That's absolutely massive and maybe like 1,000 miles long or something along that scale, maybe 500 miles long. So this is pretty extreme, but I bring it up because as it turns out, building a planet from scratch is even more extreme than this. So when it comes to the why you might build an artificial planet, it's not really, I think, ultimately because you want living space, because if you can build an artificial planet, you can easily build many O'Neill space colonies. But I have to think that a project like this would be if a civilization hypothetically reached such an advanced state that they wanted to test their limits, right? Like this is not, you don't just do this because like, wow, we really have an overpopulation issue. Let's build a new planet. This is more like we're going to build a new planet because we can. Now that may not be a good enough reason, but still, it's worth thinking about, and that's what we're going to do. So let's move on to talk about how to build a planet from scratch. So if you're going to build a planet, the first thing you have to think about is the fact that there's a lot of material there. Like, where are you going to get the material? You can't take it from Earth, right? When we make spaceships, we obviously make the material from Earth. And if we were to make, a very big space station, we would presumably also make that same material by, mining the minerals that we need and the metals and producing the metals on Earth and then bringing them up. But there's just such a huge mass of material needed to make a planet that there's pretty much two options that Hempsell outlines. Option one is you could take the mass needed from the gas giants like Jupiter. And option two, which he prefers, is you should harvest the mass that you need for your planet directly from the sun. The way he proposes that you do this is to actually scoop out material from the sun using magnetic fields, as he says, in a similar manner to a Bussard interstellar ramjet. So briefly, the Bussard ramjet is a theoretical method for propulsion. Basically, a spacecraft will scoop up hydrogen from the interstellar medium. I don't know what they mean by that. Oh, the matter and radiation that exists in the space between the star systems. So it's going to be scooping up hydrogen from just the diffuse gases that are in space, and it uses this huge funnel-shaped magnetic field and then compresses the hydrogen until thermonuclear fusion occurs, which then provides the thrust that counteracts the energy drain from actually like trying to suck in the hydrogen from a diffuse medium, and then uses that as the energy. So the idea with the sun harvesting technique is it's going to use a massive magnetic field to suck in material directly from the sun's mantle. So figure 3 kind of gives a schematic for how this works. You can see that you have it's just a box that says electromagnetic captures. So we don't know a whole lot about this, but just assume it's something that can generate a terrifically huge magnetic field, and that's sucking material from the sun. And then after that, Hempsell proposes that the material which is brought in from the sun is passed into a fusion processor. And so nuclear fusion allows you to build the atomic mass, right? It's, you're, instead of nuclear fission where you're splitting things, you're actually combining nuclei to make new elements. And in particular, he recommends that you start off your planet making process with very heavy elements because the core of a planet typically has heavier elements than the rest. And so basically, his recommendation is you're going to bring in the hydrogen and helium, presumably from the sun, and then you're going to create a fusion reactor in space through some design that's not figured out yet, and to actually do the nuclear fusion. And then you process or almost like cast the heavy metals into ingots, which are then passed through into an electromagnetic accelerator. So think about this as like a giant railgun in space. So that's basically the idea. You got to have a huge magnetic field to suck in the material, and then you have a fusion processor to raise the to basically like make the elements that you want, and then process that into ingots, which are then shot through a massive railgun in space to go to the location that they're supposed to go. So Hempsell takes some time to talk about what the mass of the planet should be, and I won't go into great depth about it, but he basically recommends that you wind up with a mass somewhere along the same mass of Mars, but a planetary size similar to the moon. And he has some interesting arguments about the ideal density of a planet in terms of how that relates to the escape velocity, which in turn will make it easier to live on that planet and then treat it as a base for doing other space missions and things like that. I won't go into that in a lot of detail, but what I do want to talk more about is these ingots. So he says something pretty wild. He says he wants 10 to the 19 kilograms of material delivered each day to the planet construction site, assuming that the core will take 30 years to build. And so these are absolutely insane numbers. 10 to the 19th a year, whatever the number that comes after quadrillions is. And I don't remember that off the top of my head, but maybe someone can remind me in the comment section. But this is just an absolutely massive amount of material. And there's a lot of assumptions here. He says the assumed production rate is 100 ingots a day, with each ingot being 10 to the 17 kilograms. Okay, so I guess I did actually convert that. 10 to the 17th is 100 trillion metric tons. So each ingot's going to be 100 trillion metric tons, and there will be 100 of them produced a day. And the idea is that he suggests that these ingots are fired through that railgun, and it will take about a year to reach the planet location. And then the planet construction is achieved by simply allowing these ingots to collide with the protoplanet. The protoplanet he doesn't really talk about, but he's assuming that there's some kind of mass at location already. And the idea is that you're going to try to synthesize the planet in an orbital path that's somewhere, in the same zone as Earth, hopefully in a different part of orbit. But it's going to be somewhere between Venus and Mars to be in the optimal habitable zone for liquid water. So the idea is these ingots are being produced and they're being fired through this railgun, and then they're coming out and they're intersecting the orbit of your nucleus of your starting protoplanet. And if it impacts it with the right energy, the idea is that the ingot will actually kind of melt from the kinetic energy that's involved in this collision and will start to fuse with the core. It's funny, but the more I talk about this, the more and more ridiculous it seems, because he says that biasing the impact locations, which is to say biasing where the ingot lands on the protoplanet, is also assumed to be the method to get the correct spin, as well as circularize the heliocentric orbit. And so it's almost like I'm picturing like billiard balls, right? Like these ingots, these massive ingots are basically like really, really big meteors that are slamming into the growing planet core. And depending on the angle at which the ingots hit the growing core, it's going to put some like some spin on the ball. So that's pretty amazing. So all of this is happening over the course of 30 years in his proposed build schedule. And if there's 100 being made per day and there's 365 days in a year, then the point is you're going to have basically somewhere in the same order of magnitude of about 40,000 ingots per planet under construction. So these will be basically these ingots, these massive 100 trillion metric ton ingots will be flying around, and there will be about 40,000 of them in flight at any given moment during this 30-year period. And this is kind of where I say, okay, well, you've heard of like not in my backyard. You know, it's like, hey, they want to build a nuclear power plant. Hey, that's great. Hey, they're going to build it next door to you. It's kind of like, well, maybe not. Could you put it somewhere else, like maybe out in the desert or something? That's kind of like a not in my backyard sort of issue. But this is where I start to think that this type of construction activity, even if we're really far in the future and we have diversified our living spaces, we're on lots of, we've terraformed other planets, and we have lots of, O'Neill space colonies and things like that. I just think that having these massive celestial bodies flying around, 40,000 of them are in flight at any given time, just doesn't seem like a smart idea. And I know the solar system is a really, really big place, but I think if you look it up, and I did calculate a little bit, this would be, 21 kilometers in diameter, right? And it would be going about 16,000 kilometers per hour, right? And I did look up the meteor which supposedly wiped out the dinosaurs. I say supposedly because, these are calculated values. We don't really know for sure. Was 14 kilometers in diameter and was going 43,000 kilometers per hour. So our ingot is bigger. It's 21 kilometers in diameter, so it's significantly bigger than the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs. And it's not going as fast. It's going about a little more than a third of the speed of the dinosaur meteor. But basically, it's like if we had a construction scenario that involved 40,000 extinction level potential meteors kind of like flying around in the same habitable zone as Earth, that's pretty much an extinction level threat, right? There's really it's kind of hard to view it any other way. Now, you could argue that our aim, hopefully in the future, with this ramjet and huge railgun is so good that it's not going to happen. But I would almost think that this is like a not in my solar system kind of construction activity. So if we're going to build a planet from scratch, I think maybe we're going to build this in a different solar system, one that doesn't have any habited planets. So timing is another feature of this project. So it said the core build time is 30 years, but that's not even the beginning of what you have to do, pretty much. Later, the author says that the planet needs to cool to produce a surface temperature where you start to see land masses form. Basically, like it was so hot from all these impacts that you had to eventually you're going to have to condense the material to be able to start doing things like terraforming. And the cooling phase would take around 10,000 years. And then towards the end of this cooling phase, the ocean and atmosphere can be added as desired. And I like that he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about that. I think that that's sort of funny to me because it's like, oh, well, that's sort of trivial, right? And in a way, it is trivial compared to what we're talking about doing. So if you were a Kardashev 1 or 2 civilization and you had a spare 10 to 20,000 years and you were bored, you could maybe actually envision doing something like this. So this is those are the assumptions, and those are some big assumptions. Like I don't know if we're ever going to, as a species, achieve that kind of thing, but this is what it would take if you wanted to build a planet from scratch. In his conclusion, he says the construction of the artificial planets does not seem to represent any fundamental feasibility problem. That is, it would not break any laws of physics. And I love that because to me, that's a very low bar. If I was at work and I proposed a new project and I said, hey, I think this project we should really think about doing it. After all, it doesn't break any laws of physics. Then I don't think my proposal would be likely to be accepted. You need usually like a little bit of a higher bar in order to actually contemplate and execute a project in real life. So it's not a good bar for real life, but it's actually a really good bar for a thought experiment. And the thing I love about this this paper is that he takes the time to suspend disbelief and to say, hey, let's make some assumptions, and they're pretty wild assumptions, like unlimited energy, unlimited time, the ability to make some of these things like the interstellar ramjet, and say what would be possible under a completely different set of assumptions. And that's the sort of exercise that I actually think we need to do more of, because that's basically what thinking outside the box is. And if you don't consider the box, if you don't think about what the assumptions are, you're in the box and you don't know that you're in the box. And I think to really unlock creativity, sometimes you have to be willing to let your imagination go to kind of crazy places, or places that people would almost like laugh at. Like I have been kind of laughing at this paper a little bit. And I think that we should keep on thinking wild and out there like that. And I imagine, I'm not familiar with Dr. Hempsell's other work, but I have a strong sense that this is a person who is probably very creative and very effective at what he does, because he's willing to suspend his disbelief and take a hypothesis to its conclusion. And I hope that going forward, we're all a little bit more willing to have a stupid idea, because I think a stupid idea is sort of a prerequisite to having a really good idea. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I love this paper. As I said, I've been looking at it off and on for several years, and every time I read it, I get a laugh. It's really a lot of fun. An example of where, this one just caught me off guard. Sorry, I was just reading a little bit more. Is he says, obviously, this schedule, that is like the long wait, dominates the business finance, as almost all the investment is at the start of the process. We have seen the saleable value of the planet can be estimated at around 10 to the 14th dollars. So assuming the money is borrowed on a 2% basis, the construction cost would need to be 10 to the 70 planets to the cent. That is considered an unlikely eventuality. I'm just cracking up, because it's like, it's such a ridiculous premise. But then he kind of like breaks into a business finance discussion. And I have to wonder, like, I'm sure he was cracking up as he wrote this. So it's a really great paper. I hope you'll check it out. And I want to thank you for watching the video, and I hope you'll join me again soon. Bye.